The next item of business is a statement by Hamza Yousaf on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Hamza Yousaf for up to 10 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 2 weeks ago, I promised that I would return to this chamber to outline changes I would look to make to the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. These changes are in response to the very genuine concerns I heard from a number of stakeholders and indeed members across the chamber over the past few months. In particular, it is the operation of the stirring up of hatred offences that has been subject to considerable attention. I want to remind members of one of the key underlying principles of the bill, and it is, at its most simple, this: tackling hate crime, a principle which the vast majority of stakeholders and members here share and applaud. Confronting hate crime is central to building the Scotland that we all want to see. This is something that members 2 weeks ago overwhelmingly voted for, and it's something that as parliamentarians we promised to work together on to achieve. We can't let down victims of hate crime. We must take forward our plans to legislate in order to ensure that hate crime legislation is fit for the 21st century, and most importantly, affords sufficient protection to those who need it. I highlighted in this chamber 2 weeks ago how hate crime remains a significant issue that we must tackle. There were more than 5,600 hate crimes reported to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service last year. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. As we know, much hate crime is not reported at all. So we cannot afford to be complacent. Having effective hate crime legislation makes it clear to victims, perpetrators, communities and, of course, to wider society that offences motivated by prejudice will be treated seriously. I have listened to the voices raising concerns on the bill. I have reflected on our agreement in this chamber to seek common ground and to seek compromise. I have spoken to a number of stakeholders to seek their views on the areas of the bill that I committed to consider. I spoke to the Faculty of Advocates, the Law Society, the Humanist Society, the Catholic Church, the Scottish Police Federation, a number of those in the creative industry, and a range of equality organisations, including many others as well. I thank them all for their time, but most importantly for their trusted advice. I'm also mindful of the request from a number of those across the chamber, I think a point made in particular by the Liberal Democrats, that any proposed change or changes the government was willing to make should be announced as soon as possible to give committee time for due consideration. I hope by making this statement a month before the Justice Committee is due to take oral evidence is an indication of my respect for the parliamentary process and how important I think scrutiny of proposals are. Presiding Officer, the operation of the new stirring up hatred offences has raised concerns that the offences can be committed where behaviour is likely to stir up hatred, whether or not the accused intended to stir up hatred. Stirring up hatred offences are not new, and for race have existed across the nations of the UK for decades. The bill introduces new offences of stirring up hatred that cover the characteristics of age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity and variation in sex characteristics. This is a significant expansion of the stirring up of hatred offences, which have the aim of ensuring those who stir up hatred in respect of those various characteristics can be held to account under the criminal law for their actions. We must recognise, as many stakeholders do, why the bill provides for additional offences of stirring up hatred in the first place. Behaviour that stirs up hatred is corrosive. It can incite people to commit offences against individuals in the targeted group and also contribute to an atmosphere in which prejudice and discrimination is accepted as normal. It can leave entire communities feeling isolated, feeling scared and vulnerable to attack. In the most serious cases, it can directly encourage activity which threatens or endangers life. This Parliament should protect people from this distinct harm by legislating for new offences of stirring up hatred. I have, however, reflected carefully on the operation of the new offences, and in particular that the new stirring up hatred offences do not require that the accused intended to stir up hatred. People are concerned the offences could be committed by people expressing controversial views where they have no intention of stirring up hatred against any group. The bill does contain some protections against this, and the offences themselves do set a significant threshold for criminal sanction. Behaviour must, of course, be threatening or abusive. Such behaviour must be likely to stir up hatred and not merely dislike, disapproval or disrespect. And there's a defence that the accused behaviour was, in the particular circumstances, reasonable. However, having heard the views expressed both in this Parliament and indeed by a range of key stakeholders, I recognise that even with those protections that I have just outlined, there is a real risk that if the offences don't require intent to stir up hatred, there could be a perception and indeed uncertainty that the operation of this aspect of the offences may be used to prosecute what are entirely legitimate acts of expression. This in itself might lead to an element of self-censorship. That is not the aim of the legislation. The bill does not seek to stifle robust debate, public discourse, or artistic freedoms. Instead, the bill seeks to offer greater protection to those who suffer from this particularly damaging type of offending behaviour, while respecting freedom of expression. I want people across this chamber and across Scotland to come together so that we can ensure hate crime law can deal with the problem of stirring up hatred in an effective and appropriate way. That is why I think it's important to put the concerns over the question of the operation of the new offences beyond doubt. I can advise that the Scottish Government will therefore lodge Stage 2 amendments to the bill to make the new stirring up hatred offences intent only. I hope this fundamental change will provide necessary reassurance that the new stirring up hatred offences strike an appropriate balance between respecting freedom of expression while protecting those impacted by people who set out to stir up hatred. In making this change, I will maintain the distinct approach that the bill currently adopts in relation to the racial stirring up of hatred offences, which will continue to apply as they do at the moment and as they have done so for the last 34 years. Racial stirring up hatred offences in the form they are in this bill have existed across the UK, including in England and Wales, for decades, and I see no reason to fundamentally adjust what is a long-standing approach and protection that has worked well in practice. I would be concerned about community cohesion through any weakening of the existing protection in relation to race. This change to intent only for the additional characteristics will have direct impacts and implications for other ancillary aspects of the new stirring up of hatred offences. I'm open to consider further reforms, such as the operation of the reasonableness defence and the provisions concerning freedom of expression, in light of my intention to bring forward amendments to make the new offences intent only. I'm committed to engage with this Parliament and indeed stakeholders as the bill undergoes the scrutiny process, to consider whether further amendments should be made in these ancillary areas. There is one further specific area we want in particular to hear Parliament's voice through the scrutiny process, and that is the use of modernised language within the bill. In the area of statutory aggravations contained in the bill, there has been support to look again at whether the test of convincing malice and ill will could be changed to the test as recommended by Lord Brackadale, namely to demonstrating hostility. This is an area I'm also committed to engaging on further in order to consider the effect those changes would have and whether those changes may be beneficial at Stage 2. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I'm very aware there are other views and concerns expressed, and I think an effective scrutiny process will ensure these are all aired during healthy and robust debate. But I want to make sure Parliament was advised in good time of the Scottish Government's response to the key concerns expressed about the bill. Presiding Officer, I know that hate crime is an emotive subject, I know all too well that it is a deeply personal one too. I want to give this criminal law legislation the best chance of affording the protection to those that need it. I look forward to working with members on the bill. I would like to thank the stakeholders that I have engaged with to allow me to make this announcement today. I also want to reiterate that if I have to appear in front of committee or Parliament during the recess, I'll make myself available on weekends, whatever it takes. I'm happy to do so because, as I say, this bill is needed in terms of the protections for those who are vulnerable to the stirring up of hatred. And any attempts to filibuster or delay this bill should be thwarted. I just want to finally mention the Misogynistic Harassment Working Group. I want to reassure members that this remains a priority, and we will be setting out our plans for the working group next month. I have taken numerous bills through this Parliament. I've always been a believer that the legislation can only be strengthened by scrutiny. I hope I've demonstrated a willingness to listen and act where there are concerns, and I reiterate there will be other areas of the bill where there are undoubtedly concerns, and I will continue to listen to members and key stakeholders throughout the parliamentary process. I'm confident that going forward, the debate around the bill will help to build consensus on how we effectively tackle hate crime and how we keep working together on building an inclusive and just Scotland for all.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement, and I'll allow up to 20 minutes for that. Can I call, please, Liam Kerr?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement and for coming forward with this statement today. We now know that the Hate Crime Bill has received more written responses than any other bill in Scottish Parliament history. Scottish Conservatives warned about the avalanche of opposition in our debate recently and remain really worried about the issue of the rest of the bill not being given sufficient scrutiny because of the controversial Part 2 to ensure, his words, it is fit for the 21st century. Now, the amendments proposed by the Justice Secretary today do not begin to go far enough, and respondents will note he hasn't actually admitted that the first draft is a threat to free speech. He makes no mention of the threshold for criminality with regards to threatening or abusive, which represents a significant difference to the legislation south of the border. There's still no protection for anything said in the privacy of your own home, and the vague clauses on inflammatory material are not mentioned. So I'll ask the Cabinet Secretary 3 questions. Why, in the face of such outrage over Part 2, has the Justice Secretary only committed to considering amendments for the protection of freedom of speech rather than bring them forward now, as the Parliament demanded 2 weeks ago? And what will he bring forward to protect people from prosecution for things said in the privacy of their own home? And finally, why did the Justice Secretary refuse to listen to the unprecedented backlash against the new stirring up offences and simply scrap Part 2 to allow the rest of the legislation to proceed to full scrutiny and swift enactment?
Hamza Yousaf.
I thank Liam Kerr for his questions. What I think dealing with, effectively the new stirring up offences by changing them to intent only will actually mitigate and ameliorate the vast majority of concerns expressed by a number of stakeholders. So, for example, a number of the stakeholders that I referenced in my opening remarks told me that if we made the change to intent only, then that would mitigate the vast majority of their concerns because, you know, the reasonableness defence may well not be needed because you've moved to intent only, for example. So a number of stakeholders made that point to me. I think having made this change now, we can concentrate on some of the other areas of the bill that the member raises, such as the freedom of expression clauses, such as Part 1, such as the statutory aggravations. In terms of other areas of the bill, freedom of expression, the private dwelling clauses, these are all things that we should be capable of discussing, taking evidence on, bringing forward amendments if necessary at stage 2 as parliamentarians and as legislators. We should be capable of doing that. I have said in my opening remarks that I will make myself available if necessary to work over the recess. I would hope others would equally be willing to work as hard as we possibly can to bring this legislation forward. And the very final point I'd make to Liam Kerr, simply scrapping the stirring up offences for me is not an option. These stirring up offences are corrosive in society. Victim Support Scotland rightly said a fortnight ago that those who are the targets of hatred cannot afford to wait years and years for the vital protections they require. The statutory aggravations already exist. with the exception of the one that we're adding for H. It is the stirring up offences that are particularly corrosive in society, and we should not shy away from that vital protection.
Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I would also like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for a prior sight of his statement. And I think hate crime is something that we all throughout this chamber find absolutely unacceptable. This change of heart is therefore welcome and is useful to have those changes prior to scrutiny of the bill in order that they can be tested properly by the committee. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, when stakeholders say that this largely meets their needs, whether they would still want to see further protections regarding freedom of speech in the face of the bill? There's also a great deal of interest from stakeholders in the misogyny working group, and I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary could tell us today who will actually sit on this group and when it will first meet.
Hamza Yousaf.
Thank Rhoda Grant for the tone of her questions as well as the substance of those questions. In terms of the direct question that she asked about freedom of expression clauses, the short answer is absolutely yes. There are a number of stakeholders did raise that concern, from the Catholic Church to the Equality Network and many in between. So that is an area that I will give some further consideration to, as I mentioned in my statement. In terms of the misogynistic harassment working group, I do think that I said in my statement that we should be able to come back to this chamber, or certainly update Parliament, I should say, next month on that. She may have seen that the Law Commission has produced, in England and Wales, has produced some work today. It's around about 500 pages, but has produced some work on the issue of this very topic, and I'll be looking at that as well. But I should come back, or at least be able to update members, I should say, next month on that vital piece of work.
We move to open questions, please, and I have Patrick Harvey, followed by Rona Mackay.
Advanced side of the statement, but the statement doesn't deal with the fundamental challenges of proving intent. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary why he hasn't chosen to take a similar approach to that taken in the Public Order Bill in relation to stirring up racial hatred, where intent or likelihood are both covered? Where intent is not proved, it's a defence that the accused was not aware that their behaviour might be threatening or abusive. Surely if we don't take that approach, we'll risk a situation where very extreme actions which clearly stir up hatred will be legitimised on the basis that an accused can merely argue my intention was something else.
Hamza Yousaf.
Can I thank Patrick Harvey for his question, and can I put on record his steadfast support in relation to tackling hate crime in all its forms. Can I say to Patrick Harvey, the concerns that he articulated are the very concerns that I had at the beginning of this bill process, that if we were to create the new stirring up offences as intent only, then a simple defence for the accused would be that I didn't intend to do X, Y or Z. This is a proposition I tested with the Faculty of Advocates, I tested with the Law Society, I tested with some lawyers and solicitors that I know myself. And they provided me with a very significant degree of reassurance that it is not simply a case of the accused saying that they did not intend to do something, and therefore a judge, jury or sheriff would simply accept that as the word of the accused. What the judge, jury or sheriff would look to do is look at all of the contextual factors surrounding an incident and determine whether or not there was an intent there to stir up hatred or not. So it is not simply the case that an accused could say, I did not intend to do that. And intent, of course, has to be proven in a number, if not most, offences as well. So I do accept the point that Patrick Harvey is making, that we have to give confidence to those who will be affected by the new stirring up offences, that they are still significant and that they can be prosecuted. And I'm more than happy to work with Patrick Harvey on that.
Rona Mackay, followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the Cabinet Secretary's statement, he reminded members of the key underlying principles of the bill tackling hate crime. I wholeheartedly agree that we should not lose sight of this aim. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that we now owe it to victims of hate crime to work together to create world-leading legislation that we as a Parliament can all be proud of?
Hamza Yousaf.
Yes, in short, and I think it's a really important question that Rona Mackay asks, because we do sometimes forget that it is not always the loudest voices that are the ones that we should only be listening to. We should be listening to those, I think, in this bill, who, of course, raise their concerns around freedom of expression. I think that's legitimate, and these are concerns that clearly I've demonstrated we're listening to. But we must also listen to those who are the most affected, the most at target, the most vulnerable when it comes to hate crime, and therefore we should not delay this bill. We should not attempt to thwart it in any way. We should work hard as we possibly can between now and the end of the parliamentary session to make sure we have an absolutely effective piece of legislation that protects the most vulnerable in society and at the same time gives people absolute confidence in relation to the freedom of expression. The two are not mutually exclusive, and I have every confidence we can do that.
Liam MacArthur, followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I too thank the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of his statement and indeed for responding positively to my call earlier this month for the proposed changes to Part 2 of the bill to be brought forward well ahead of the committee beginning our Stage 1 oral evidence. As he says, the proposed stirring up offences to this bill have led to serious, widespread and legitimate concerns about the consequences for freedom of expression, and the intent to safeguard, I think, is a welcome step in the right direction. But given that Lord Brackadale said, and I quote, almost every case which could be prosecuted as a stirring up offence could also be prosecuted using baseline offence and an aggravation, can the Cabinet Secretary offer examples of behaviour that would be caught by a stirring up offence but wouldn't be caught by the bill's aggravation?
Hamza Yousaf.
So again, if he refers back to my statement, I made the point that it is important that the criminal law appropriately prosecutes legislation and records it in a way that I think gives confidence to the public. So, you know, he's absolutely right. There are a number of, pieces of legislation that could be used to prosecute, offences under current law in relation to stirring up of hatred. But it is really, really important that stirring up as a corrosive offence, as a corrosive behaviour that affects not just an individual, but could actually involve an entire community, is prosecuted in that way. And so if I was to give him that example, the reason why stirring up offences are needed is because it doesn't need an individual to be at the receiving end of it. It could be an entire community, the Muslim community, the gay community, the people who have disabilities. It could be a community that is affected by a stirring up offence, whereas the aggravators, the statutory aggravators in Part 1 of the bill, generally, as far as I know, but I will look at this in more detail, of course, are offences that are attached to an individual. And so that's why I think it's really important that although behaviours related to stirring up of hatred may well be able to be prosecuted in some other way, it's really important that they are recorded in the correct way, not just for the purposes of this bill, but I hope to give confidence to those communities that are targeted by that hatred.
Ruth Maguire, followed by Liz Smith.
Presiding Officer, I welcome that the Scottish Government have listened to voices who raised concerns on this important bill and that they've acted. As the Cabinet Secretary mentioned, the Law Commission in England and Wales has published a report on hate crime reform today. I note their proposal in terms of stirring up hatred, that the focus should be on deliberate incitement of hatred, providing greater protection for freedom of speech where no intent can be proven. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary's response to the report's recommendations, please?
Hamza Yousaf.
So, Ruth Maguire, well, forgive me, as I say, I think the Law Commission report is near enough 500 pages, or maybe just shy of it, and I've just seen and skimmed the brief headlines of it, and I will take time to look at it tonight and over the coming few days. But in general, on the point that Ruth Maguire raises, I hope I've been able to address that we're moving for the new offences of stirring up hatred to intent only. I think that will help to give some reassurance, I think, to the concerns that she raised around about a fortnight ago. I think she, if I remember correctly, specifically highlighted the concerns of the Humanist Society, and they were one of the organisations, the stakeholders that I engaged with, and they were, and I'm sure they will articulate this if asked, they were very positive about that change coming forward. So yes, I will look at the Law Commission report, but I think that the change that I have announced today will go a long way in hopefully giving reassurance to those like Ruth Maguire that had concerns about how the bill was previously drafted.
Liz Smith, followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you. Could I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he's now confirming that he recognises that there are serious flaws in several key sections of this bill, including wording which is open to misinterpretation, and that notwithstanding what he's announced today, he will address these other concerns before the scrutiny at the Justice Committee so that there's no hint of us making bad law?
Hamza Yousaf.
I accept the characterisation from Liz Smith. I don't accept that there's key fundamental flaws in the bill. I think there are proposed amendments that we should look at, that all of us have a responsibility as parliamentarians. Liz Smith has been a parliamentarian for longer than me, has no doubt scrutinised bills over the years and done so very effectively. We should be able to do that as a parliament. Actually, the change that I announced to intent only will have an ancillary effect on a number of other areas of the bill, and I think I will give that consideration, as I mentioned in my remarks. But it is incumbent on each of us as parliamentarians, whether you're opposition or me in government, to make sure that we engage in this process, I think, not just constructively, but with an open mind. And of course, if there are changes that are proposed, then I will listen to them with an open mind, as I have done thus far. But I do not think that they are fundamental flaws in the bill. I think if there are concerns, they can be addressed through the normal parliamentary process.
Christine Graham, followed by Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary will recall my concerns specifically about the term stirring up in hatred offences without the necessity of intent or mens rea, for which there is a plethora of case law. Can I therefore welcome the measured move requiring intent or mens rea, which for me endeavours to strike the balance between freedom of speech and expression, which is not, of course, absolute, and incitement to criminal acts?
Hamza Yousaf.
I thank Christine Graham. She has raised this issue with me, of course, publicly in the Chamber, but also privately, and I appreciate her experience and knowledge of the law in this regard. And as I say, I think for a number of people, there was very key and genuine concerns around the offences being intent and likely to stir up hatred. I'm pleased by moving to intent only. It certainly seems to me that a number of stakeholders and indeed members across this chamber will have not just greater confidence in this legislation moving forward, but hopefully will be able to strengthen this bill so it gives the protections we all want it to the most vulnerable in our society.
Alex Rowley, followed by Donald Cameron.
Presiding Officer, it's welcome that the Cabinet Secretary has spoken to key stakeholders, and I hope that he is committed to continuing to do so as this bill makes progress. Beyond the suggested amendments proposed today, the faculty of advocates have suggested that some of the definitions in the bill are too broad and too vague. For example, with regard to the perceived religious affiliation. To avoid a repeat of the problems with the Behavioural Football Act, is the Cabinet Secretary considering amendments that would tighten the definitions within this bill?
Hamza Yousaf.
Again, my answer will be similar to the one I gave to Liz Smith, that yes, of course, the government will keep an open mind, as I have done. I mean, I've taken numerous bills through this Parliament. I think the last bill I took was I accepted every single opposition amendment in terms of the Biometrics Commissioner. I can't promise I'll do exactly the same for this bill, but I will approach it with that in mind, being open-minded. I take very seriously what the faculty of advocates have to say. It's why I went back to the faculty before making this statement to take a view from them, and they've been hugely helpful. The Dean and the Vice Dean, who are both new in their roles, have been exceptionally helpful, and I thank them for that. So, in short, my answer is yes, of course, if there are amendments or proposed amendments on the issues that Alex Rowley mentions, then they will get an absolute fair hearing, and I will give them due consideration.
Donald Cameron, followed by John Mason. Oh, we seem to have lost Donald. Oh, no, there he is. Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I refer to my register of interest as a member of the Faculty of Advocates? As the Cabinet Secretary will be aware, the references to freedom of expression in sections 11 and 12 are controversial because they only refer to two protected characteristics, sexual orientation and religion. Why is that, and what is his response to the Faculty of Advocates who say that the current wording does not appear to afford any significant protection?
Hamza Yousaf.
Can I thank Donald Cameron for his question? I think it's a very important one. If I can give him some reassurance, that very point that he made around the very specific nature of the freedom of expression clauses was mentioned to me by the Equality Network, was mentioned to me by the faculty, mentioned to me by the Catholic Church, mentioned to me by the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities, and the answer I gave to them was that I will absolutely look again at the freedom of expression clauses as I articulated in my statement. Can we look at a more general freedom of expression clause? Can we look at reinstating the freedoms people have under ECHR Article 10, for example? These are all considerations that I will look to make. So in short, my answer to him is yes, we will look at those. The reasons why they were so specific was because these were specific freedom of expression clauses that were asked by particular stakeholders at the time when we were in consultation around the bill, whether it was our roadshows or the consultation that the government did at the time. But I accept his general point that we should look to see if we can have a more broader freedom of expression clause as opposed to the more limited specific ones we have in the bill as currently drafted.
And a quick question from John Mason, please.
Thank you. Following Patrick Harvey's question, can the Cabinet Secretary reassure us that it will not become too difficult to get a conviction, the bar's not being raised too high, and also there won't be confusion because now race is treated differently from the others?
Hamza Yousaf.
I'm not sure if John Mason can hear Christine Graham behind me, but she's shouting there is plenty of case law. And that is the point that I hope I can give some reassurance around. That I did test this, because this was exactly my concern if we moved to intent only. I didn't want there to be an offence that frankly couldn't be prosecuted or was extremely difficult to be prosecuted. And the assurances I got from the Faculty of Advocates and the Law Society in particular were extremely helpful in that regard. So it will ultimately be, of course, up to the Justice Committee to decide who they will hear oral evidence from. But if they do choose the Faculty of Advocates and or the Law Society, I think this will be an area that people will want to test. And I hope that if they hear what I heard, they will get the necessary assurances that we can have the new stirring of offences intent only. That will be effective in terms of a protection for the most vulnerable in our society, and at the same time won't impinge on people's freedom of expression.
That concludes questions on the Cabinet Secretary's statement. Apologies to Fulton McGregor, Claire Baker and Elaine Smith for not being able to take their questions.